This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another one of our speaker series. Today is the 14th of May, and we're here with Zack, who's a geologist at Occidental Petroleum Corporation in Denver, Colorado. Currently, he works as a planning project manager for Oxy's Powder River Basin asset in Wyoming. Previously, he worked in the field in North Dakota and West Virginia as a geosteerer and a mudlogger. He earned his bachelor's degree in geology from Ohio State University, and here to tell you all about how rocks rock. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Zack. How are you today? Thanks for doing this.
Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Kira, thanks for asking me. I'm happy to be a part of it. Yeah, I hope everybody's doing well, staying safe. So I'm excited. Like I said, I don't know if everybody heard me earlier, but I did have some slides and pictures and stuff, so I can send that out later on to Chuck or Kira. And if you have any questions or ever want to email me about anything, please feel free. I love talking about geology. I don't really do a whole lot of it in my current job, but the first 8 years of my career I did, and we can talk about all of that. So I'm happy. I think is this a scouting organization?
Yes, yeah, we're involved with scouts, but this is also an open to the public type of supplemental thing. So
great. Well, I was a scout when I was younger. I didn't make Eagle Scout. I wasn't a very good scout. I enjoyed the social functions and the camping trips more than I did doing the merit badges. But had I known that there was a geology merit badge, I almost 100% would have done that one. That would have been right up my alley. So like Chuck said, I live in Denver with my wife. I grew up in Ohio. But my wife and I moved out to Denver when I got a job at Anadarko Petroleum 8 years ago. I still work at kind of the same company. They got bought by Occidental last year, but we still work and live in Denver. And geology is really it's been a passion of mine for a long time. But I didn't always know that I wanted to be a geologist. It was about a year-long experience in college of trying to figure out what the heck I wanted to do. I started college as a doctor, wanted to be a doctor, and then quickly found out I didn't like blood, and I didn't want to be a student for 35 years. And then I switched to psychology, and psychology wasn't for me. And then I switched to history. I still very much love history, and geology in a sense is kind of like that. But I had a love for the natural world, and really ultimately it kind of came down to, and I'm sure there's people on this call that can relate when you're driving in a car or on a road trip, and you look out the window and you see just a really awesome landscape or beautiful landscape or crazy rock formation, and you wonder to yourself, how did that get to be the way that it is? And that curiosity is really what kind of drove me to falling in love with geology. I wanted to be able to look at a landscape and at least be able to think of what sort of processes were behind the resulting formation there. And so I always loved rocks and minerals growing up. I visited. I had my brother, sister, and all my cousins. My mom lived in Massachusetts, so Massachusetts holds a very, very special place in my heart. I still get out there as much as I can. But like Ohio, geologies or the surface deposits in Massachusetts are all glacial. Just thanks to the 50,000 years ago when the glaciers and the cold planet was really the name of the game, and so glacial geology is really not my favorite, just because it's so young. But it is really responsible for why Cape Cod, which is one of your most recognizable Massachusetts features, is the way it is. And Cape Cod is one of my favorite places on the planet. And so I took a class in geology when I was took a class called Geological Hazards by Dr. Michael Barton, who's a salty Brit who ended up being my undergrad mentor. And that class was all about like volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis and how you mitigate those and if there's any advance warning. And it was mind blowing. It was fascinating. I wanted to be a volcanologist immediately after that, and then realized there's like 5 jobs in volcanology on the entire world, and so I had to readjust from there. But I always tell my wife that I want a roadside geology book of every state in the country. And so far I have two. I think I have Ohio and Colorado. So, I got some goals, got some stuff to work up to. So, I think really what I can talk to here is I can give some people some sort of fundamentals of geology, and then I'll talk through, I was looking at the merit badge and looks like they want you to talk through what are some of the earth energies. I'll really focus on oil and gas there because that's really my expertise. And then I'll talk about, what school is like and what some jobs are there, if that sounds good. And then we'll have some questions.
Great.
Cool.
Sounds great. Thanks.
So, yeah. So really, if you find yourself curious about how a landscape got to be the way it is, I can give you some of the fundamentals. When I was like putting this together, I was like, oh my God, there's like 100 fundamentals that I could talk about. And it was fun going through my old books and looking at old pictures, but I was able to boil it down to like 5. So we'll do that. And the first one really that I want to touch on, I'm sorry I don't have the slides. I had some cool images, but the geologic time scale is really, really long. It's like unfathomably long. When you consider that the universe is probably 13.5 billion years old and the Earth is over 4.5 billion years old, it's not even something that we can really even comprehend. And so considering that modern day humans, Homo sapiens, didn't even really show up on the time scale until like 200,000 years ago, that's like this on that scale. And so if you were to put it into like a calendar context with the Earth forming on January 1st, the first primitive life wouldn't even really show up until March. And this is like just algae. Your first fish wouldn't show up until November. So you're 11 months in and you don't even have really like cool fish. Dinosaurs roam the world from December 16th to December 26th, and then humans show up 12 minutes before New Year's Eve. So it's just kind of crazy to consider how long that is. The other thing really that has almost one of the overarching impacts on our landscape is plate tectonics. And this wasn't even actually really it's still a theory. It hasn't technically been proven. It's not a law. And some scientists still debate about it, but it's accepted as common knowledge now, continental drift and plate tectonics. But it's the reason that we have the Appalachians, the Rockies. It's the reason why Massachusetts is the way it is right now. And there's a cool map I have that shows there's really 7 major plates and several other smaller ones, and they all move independently of each other. And where they crash into each other is called a convergent zone. And that's where one plate gets destroyed or both plates get destroyed. So where you have crust on crust convergent zones is where you get mountains. So that's Himalayas right now. The Himalayas are still growing. And where you have ocean and ocean, one of those gets subducted under the other one, and that's where you get volcanoes. And so that's why you have the Ring of Fire all through Alaska and eastern China and through Japan, down through all through Indonesia. That whole area is all convergent zones being subducted. And then on the west coast of America, where you have California and the ocean, they're sliding past each other in what's called a transform relationship. And that's where you get a bunch of earthquakes out there. And so that's why California is always earthquake prone. And so, yeah, that's where you get, oh, thanks. My wife brought me some water. And so one of the more famous spreading areas where Earth is actually being created is in the Atlantic Ocean. And so Europe and North America are actually getting farther away from each other. And these plates move at about the same speed that your fingernails grow. I had some really cool pictures about the rocks. I apologize, but there's 3 different kinds of rocks. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on this because everybody is probably somewhat familiar with those, but your metamorphic rocks, sedimentary rocks, and igneous rocks. Metamorphic rocks are igneous or sedimentary rocks that have been heated by volcanic activity or mantle activity coming up from the earth, and they've been changed into something else. So your chalkboards, for example, that slate, that was a shale that you could go out and find in your backyard that got heated by earth forces and got turned into a harder material. A lot of us probably have igneous rocks in our houses, like our granite countertop. That's igneous rock. That was created by volcanoes. You go to Hawaii and you can see the lava erupting. That's all igneous. And then sedimentary rocks are rocks that were created from other rocks. So erosion created, and wind and rain and ice broke a bunch of rocks down into smaller particles. So like Utah, if you've ever been to Utah, you see those red rocks out there. Utah is like 100% sandstone, and it's a beautiful place. I would highly recommend checking it out. And then there are some actual laws in geology. Laws are things like the law of thermodynamics, the law of gravity. They've been proven through experiments, and they're the same anywhere in the universe. On Mars, on Jupiter, in the Andromeda Galaxy, it's going to be the same anywhere. And so some of those laws in geology are the law of superposition. So that means that rocks below other rocks are older. That's just, you're not going to have it any other way unless you've had a rock that was deposited like this, and then a mountain range came in and tilted it all the way over. That happens sometimes. It's actually pretty common. But when it was first deposited, you're going to have older, below, younger. All rocks are deposited flat. Thank you, gravity, essentially. If you see a rock, or if you drive through Massachusetts and you have a lot of cliffs and your road cuts there, and you see rocks that are folded or tilted, it wasn't deposited that way. It was pushed up through some geologic process over time. There's a law of cross-cutting relationships. Not even going to really spend time on that because it's easier to see with a picture. And then the other law is that theoretically, rocks could go on indefinitely when they're deposited, unless it runs out of deposition material or it comes in contact with like an ocean or something. So as you're kind of driving through the countryside or driving through and you're looking at a wall of different striations, you have an idea of how those were deposited and which ones are going to be older. Stuff on the bottom, generally always older than the stuff on the top. And then I had a really cool video to show, so I'll also send the link to the video. It's an experiment that you can actually do at home. The one I was going to show is pretty sophisticated, but you can Google sandbox thrust videos. And essentially what these experimenters do is they'll lay down different layers of sand and gravel of different competencies, and then they'll push with a crank a board that goes across it, and you can see how rocks move up onto each other and fault and fold. And it's a really good exercise to see how mountains are actually created. It's actually a really good video to show how Massachusetts was created too. So jumping down into Earth energies, I was able to come up with 5 Earth energies. I think I got them all. I don't have solar included in there because I think it's an extraterrestrial energy, but I could come up with wind, hydro, what else do I have? Geothermal, so like Iceland, definitely lots of geothermal there, coal and oil and natural gas. And so I'll touch on, I'll go into more detail in the oil and natural gas side, because like I said, that's really where my expertise is. So oil and natural gas really come from decomposed organic matter, things like forests and swamps, like Vermont and Alaska and Canada. In like 100 million years, that's where you're going to want to drill for oil for sure, because that's all going to decompose and it's going to get layered upon itself, and then it'll get buried by other rocks, and it'll decompose into oil and natural gas. But hopefully in 100 million years, we have like a tesseract that we don't actually have to do that anymore, and we'll just like have unlimited energy. Who knows? Maybe the sun will blow up and kill us all by that point. You know, we don't know. That's not fun to think about. I'm sorry. But with the right pressure and temperature, that oil and natural gas is going to get trapped in what's called your source rock. And so source rocks are a good place to drill, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they could have created the oil, but it doesn't mean that the oil would have stayed there. The oil could have leaked out by a process called migration. Through their various faults in the rock, it could have worked its way up. And so you need a source rock, a place where oil and gas is generated, but you also need a place where the rock is stored. And so there's a misconception that when you drill for oil and gas, you're drilling into like a lake of oil. That doesn't exist. You're drilling into a reservoir is what the rock is called. But the oil and gas really reside in the pore spaces within the rock. So literally think about it on like a sponge, but just on a microscopic scale. So if you were to take a straw and poke it into a sponge and then suck out the moisture from there, that's like a really simplified version of what we're doing here. You're drilling into rocks like sandstone, which are fantastic reservoir rocks because they have a lot of porosity. But porosity isn't the only thing. You need to have those pores connected to each other so the oil can travel through it. So the connectivity of the pores is called permeability. Porosity and permeability are two of your biggest indicators when geologists are looking at logs to tell if you're going to have a highly productive reservoir. But it's not just porosity and permeability. You have to have a trap rock on top of your reservoir so that the oil just doesn't continually leaking out. So really good trap rocks are shales. Shales have a lot of porosity, but the pores are not connected to each other. So there's no way for the oil to move through there. And like I mentioned, sandstones are really, really good reservoir rocks. And these different rocks have different signatures on they called logs. You run certain tools downhole, and it'll shoot gamma ray particles into the rock, and those gamma ray particles will come back to the tool, and it'll show you a specific signature. And so using those different signatures, geologists can identify if it's a sandstone, if it's a shale, if there's gas there, if there's oil there or not. And that's a huge part about looking for oil and gas. So up until really the early 2000s, oil and gas wells were drilled as vertical wells. We didn't have the technology that we do now to turn the well horizontal and drill horizontally through a lay of rock. So let's say you have several different layers of rock and you're trying to target this one. You drill a well down here, you're only contacting that rock in that one little space with your vertical well. But if you can turn it horizontally, now you're accessing way more of the reservoir. And this is a huge advancement in oil and gas drilling. And it took the US from being a really, really low producer of oil and gas and actually making it the #1 producer in the world for like the past 5 years, actually overtaking Russia and Saudi Arabia. So that was largely due to the advent of the technology of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. So what I do at my job right now, I'll tell you what I currently do, and then I'll tell you what I used to do because I think it's a lot cooler for this talk. So what I currently do, I'm more on the business and project management side right now. I manage our schedules and our inventory for preparing wells to be drilled in Powder River Basin in Wyoming. So where Powder River Basin is in Wyoming is, if you're familiar at all with Devil's Tower, which is an old volcanic stem. It's a super famous picture. Powder River Basin is generally it's pretty much in that area. So east of Yellowstone and the Tetons and all of that. So I manage the schedule for our rigs in Wyoming, and I also put together processes for getting a well from a concept to actually getting it permitted and ready to drill. So that process of getting all the permits from the landowners, from the federal and state regulators, takes about 18 months. And so we're constantly working through inventory to make sure we have enough to feed the rig. So don't do any geology. I always joke they don't let me touch the rocks anymore. But I am able to get out into the field every once in a while. I enjoy it. I enjoy the business side and the project management side, and that's probably where the trajectory of my career is going to go. But the funnest job I ever had was when I was a mudlogger and geosteer. So I worked in North Dakota and Wyoming for about a year in 2011 as a mudlogger and geosteer, and then I was a geosteer in the office for 5 years. And so as a mudlogger, essentially what you're doing is you're on the rigs, and when you drill, the deeper you go into the earth, the pressure increases around you and actually wants to collapse your pipe. It's the same concept as when you dive down to the bottom of a pool and you can feel the pressure in your ears. Same exact thing. And so in order to counteract that pressure, you have to drill with a fluid that's called drilling mud. It's literally called mud. And oftentimes it is. It's literally like you have sawdust in there with your water, or it's a calcium, sodium, potassium, like a salt solution that essentially weights the mud up to a certain pressure. And that pressure is equal to or greater than the reservoir pressure, so that it counteracts the collapsing of the pipe. And so that mud circulates through the well, and your bit is grinding up rock, and those rock cuttings are getting circulated and they come back up to the surface. As a mudlogger, what I would do is at a known depth, I would go out and scoop up the cuttings off of the shakers. It's literally just a vibrating machine that separates the fluid from the rocks. I'd take them back to the shack. I'd clean them with some acetane or something like that, which is essentially like a rubbing alcohol. And I'll look at them under a microscope, and I can tell if it's a shale, a limestone, a sandstone, and I can relay that to the geologists and the drillers to tell where we're at. And so as a geosteer, I would take that information, and as a geosteer, my whole job was to keep us in zone. So the geologist would have identified the area of highest porosity and permeability, where the most oil is, and I would try to keep the horizontal well in zone there. And so as you're drilling with your bit, behind the bit is a tool called the gamma ray tool, and that's shooting gamma rays into formation, and it's bouncing back and it's giving you a certain signature. So you can take that signature and compare it to a known signature and figure out where you're at in formation. And so that's essentially what I would do. It was like putting a puzzle together. It was a lot of fun. It was one of the funnest jobs I ever had. I had a lot of really cool maps to show you too. So I apologize for that. I did have to hide all the names and like all the identifying numbers and stuff on them, because I don't think I was allowed to show you that. But you know, screw it, I was going to show you anyway. But I was able to make a lot of cool maps, do a lot of work with seismic and really powerful software. The only problem with that job was that rigs run 24/7. And so for 5 years, nights, weekends, and holidays, I didn't have any of those. I would set my alarm literally every 2 hours at night to get up and check my computer to make sure that, you know, more data hadn't come in. And on wells that were like really high value, or were really important, or if you were lost, like if you didn't know where you were in the well, which happened all the time, you would just stay up all night long. And that was like just brutal on your body. It was brutal in relationships because you couldn't do anything. And so I got out of that. But I don't want that to scare people off. Geologists, there's different levels of things you can do. Geologists are generally the ones that are advising the geosteer. They're the ones that have identified where to drill. They're the ones that are looking at the logs and looking at the properties of the logs. So if there's people that are interested in becoming a geologist, it's an absolute blast. I would highly, highly recommend it. I got a 4-year degree from Ohio State University. Part of the reason I didn't say this in the beginning that I wanted to become a geologist is because I thought there wouldn't be as much math. In geology, that's not true. It's amazing how much math I use on a daily basis. You have to do calculus 1 through 3, physics 1 through 3, chemistry 1 through 3 as your prerequisites. And then your major classes are things like sedimentology and stratigraphy, mineralogy, petrology, geophysics, geochemistry, hydrology, stuff like that. And then if you get a Bachelor of Science over a Bachelor of Art, which I would highly recommend, you have to do a field camp. And Kira, I don't know if you remember when I did this, but Ohio State's field camp was a 7-week-long field camp. And we did ours in central Utah. It's in a place, called Sanpete Valley, Utah. And it was awesome. Looking back on it, it was awesome. While I was in it, it was like a love-hate relationship because you're hiking like 12 hours a day. Looking back on it, it was an unbelievable experience. So we drove out from Columbus. We stopped in Telluride. We went to Arches National Park. Went to Great Basin National Park, all over Utah. Yeah, it's actually pretty close to Philmont in some ways, I think, which is down in New Mexico. I would highly, highly recommend it. I mean, just like if you love rocks and just like being in nature and looking at, different structural geometries of rocks, it was really focused on geologic mapping. So it was focused on, you would have your topographic map and you would follow geologic formations along and you would map them, different strike and dip azimuths. You would take those back and create cross sections from it. And that was really the whole point of that field camp. It was, up until last week, my personal record for not having a haircut. But thanks to coronavirus, I have now beaten that personal record, and that's why I'm wearing a hat right now. So I apologize for that. But with geology, you don't have to just do oil and gas. That's certainly one avenue. Oil and gas is certainly not a good industry to be in right now, considering everything that's going on in the world, and demand for oil and gas is really, really low because nobody's driving, nobody's flying. But if you want to go the environmental side, you can work for the USGS doing state surveys, water quality sampling. I know people that work for the government on Superfund sites, cleaning up Superfund sites and mapping water pathways. You can work in academia as professors. If anybody becomes a volcanologist, I'm going to be super, super jealous because that's still like my dream job. You can work, what else did I have in there? Geohazard monitoring. So scientists are involved with advising on how buildings are built in California to withstand earthquakes. So all kinds of number of things that you can do. And that's really kind of what I had. Like I said, I can send the slides and pictures out, but if anybody has any questions,
actually we have a bunch of questions coming in. Yeah, thank you very much for doing this. That sounds super interesting. Now, my question though is, you mentioned how you thought you'd be doing less math, and then you listed off all these classes that you had to take. And I didn't even know there was anything above physics too. But would you consider that almost or equal to going to school to be a doctor? I know it's not 35 years, but yeah. Was it the same amount of work in order to learn all those things?
Yeah, and so I definitely, it was a lot of work. Those were definitely the more difficult classes that I took. It's not my natural, it's something I had to work a lot harder at. And one of my big regrets actually is that I didn't work harder at it when I was there. Especially considering all the resources that were at my disposal. There really was no excuse for me to get poor grades there. Freshman year, I was put in a health science dorm because that's what I had said as my major. And so as a result of that, I have a lot of friends that are doctors from that. And I'm glad I made the decision I did. I have nothing but respect for them. They're some of the hardest working people that I know. But certainly the math and physics and chemistry were definitely a grind, and it was a surprise that it was there in geology, especially considering in pop culture, if anybody watches Big Bang Theory, Sheldon kind of craps on geologists a lot. It's not an exact science. which is true to a certain extent. Doesn't make it any harder. It's just a lot different than engineering, where you have to have exact answers, exact measurements. Geology, there's definitely a certain art to it, and it's very much open to interpretation. But the scientific method is still used when doing experiments and putting forth theories.
All right, we had another question from the audience. What has been your favorite job through geology?
My favorite job was geosteering. I didn't get a chance to show you the maps, but there was a progression where we were kind of treated initially. We had to prove ourselves that we could do the geologic mapping on our and not just have the geologist do it. So it's a little, the terminology here is a little weird, but I wasn't technically considered a geologist until about 8 years ago. I was considered or until about 6 years ago, I was considered a geosteer, and then I moved up to be a geologist. I'm trained as a geologist, but that was just kind of a technical term. But geosteering is really like putting a puzzle together, and there's an art to it. The software is really, really cool, where you're essentially matching an unknown gamma ray signature to a known gamma ray signature, and that was definitely the funnest one.
When you said at the very beginning how Massachusetts was too young to be interesting, what do you mean? And then what are some of the other places in the world, geologically speaking?
I didn't mean it that way. Really, the majority of North America is on the surface. If you go like east of the Rockies, on the surface, it's dominated by glacial deposits. Like in Ohio, if you drive down the highway, every 50 to 100 miles, you're going to notice you drive up a ridge. That's the extent of a glacier. That's called a terminal moraine. Massachusetts is dominated by that too. Anywhere in the United States on the surface, it's dominated by that. The bedrock, however, is much, much more interesting. And I have a slide that shows that there's some super, super old rocks and really, really interesting, amazing geology in Massachusetts. Like in the Berkshires, you have 1.2 billion year old rock there. The Cape Cod bedrock, which you'll never see because it's under sand, is over 1 billion years old. So that was just a little joke. I love Massachusetts. But one of the things that's great about the West is that the arid climate there is that the rocks are a lot easier to see. And so from a geologist perspective, the easier that I can see the rocks, the better. The biology doesn't get in the way of the geology.
Cool. Let's see. We have another question. Let's see. How did you decide you wanted to do this? And you previously mentioned, some logistics, like, doctors go to school for 35 years and you don't like blood. But did you wake up one day and you say, gosh darn, I want to play with the rocks for the rest of my life?
No, definitely not. Like I said, it was like a year-long journey to find this. I'm always jealous of the people that like know exactly what they want to do, that have a passion for something and just stick with it. I think those people, that's rare to have that. For most of us, it's a journey of trying and failing at a lot of different things. And so I didn't always know that I wanted to be this. But when I stumbled upon it, it was like, yeah, obviously this is what I'm going to do. It fit. I thought I was going to be able to be outside a lot, and initially I was. And even in this job, I've had a lot of opportunities to do that. I've taken a lot of really cool field courses all over Wyoming, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. That's been really, really cool. But like I said, I tried a bunch of different things, and this one stuck.
What's your favorite kind of rock?
Oh man, it's gonna sound boring, but sandstone. I love Utah, and my wife and I mountain bike a lot, and you don't slip on Utah. You can go up, like on your mountain bike, you can go up like a 50-degree grade on your mountain bike and not slip. And all the red out there, all the iron in the rock. Whenever you see a red rock, that's iron in it. It's beautiful. I love sandstone. I also love geodes. That's more of like a mineral. But I love geodes. They're really, really cool. Actually, mineralogy in college, when you take mineralogy, you have to memorize the chemical formula of like 100 minerals. So like literally, like tourmaline is a 36 term chemical formula, and it's like a rite of passage. You just have to memorize it. I couldn't tell you what it is, but you have to memorize all those.
Jeez, that seems pretty tough. You mentioned how when went from drilling straight down to drilling it at an angle and it being a better procedure. Which one do you think is easier to get now, gas or oil?
Yep. So it kind of gas is a bit of a byproduct of oil in some circumstances, and it's gas is always easier to flow than oil is. When you think about, if you think about it like on a fluid dynamics kind of standpoint, a gas is going to be able to flow through tighter pores than a heavier fluid is going to be able to flow. So gas is always going to be easier to get. Now, when you think about it on like an economic commodity standpoint, because gas is easier to get, that's why it's cheaper, because we have way more of it than we need. So like out in your neck of the woods, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, not really into Massachusetts, but in like that New England, Appalachia area is the Marcellus Shale. And that's one of the most prolific gas formations in the entire world, is here in the United States. But 1,000 cubic meters of gas, cubic feet of gas, I'm sorry, sells for like $1.75. And so because when you consider like scarcity makes things more valuable, gas isn't scarce. And so that's why oil companies are, over the last 15 years, have now targeted oil formations more because it's more valuable. That was, however, until like a couple months ago when oil prices crashed because we had too much of it. And now nobody's drilling.
All right. While they're drilling or trying to get gas or oil, what are some of the ways that your industry protects natural resources, rather?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you think about oil and gas, a well isn't just drilled with one string of pipe. And there's all kinds of regulations that you have to follow from the state, from the feds, from the landowners. You have to get a bunch of different permissions. And so think about the pipe as like an upward facing like pirate telescope. Your pipe at the bottom is going to be smaller, and then your pipe going up hole is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the way that you would do this is you have to seal off and cement off and pipe off your aquifer. So you drill a bigger hole. It's usually like 12 inches wide. And you identify, your geologist will help you tell you where the aquifer is in the area. I don't actually know what the aquifer is in Massachusetts there. But yeah, out in Colorado, it's about like 1,200 feet deep. So you drill that with water. You don't drill that with any chemicals in the mud. You literally just drill it with water, so you're not going to get any contamination. You drill a pipe down through your aquifer, and then you literally pump cement down the pipe, and the cement seals off that aquifer. From there, you would go in with a smaller pipe and then drill down from there. So anytime you encounter any sort of sensitive formation, you're going to set a pipe and then cement that formation off. And so that's one of the huge ways that you really protect aquifers, which is the most important thing. There's all kinds of regulations to prevent spills on the surface, and you have to pay certain fines if you do spill. And so there are different levels to which operators will honor these. Your big operators like Anadarko, Occidental, really, really fantastic companies that take environmental stewardship to heart. But obviously, we could probably name up 5 major incidents off the top of our hands where the things weren't in compliance. And as a geologist, those kind of things actually really kill me because I love the natural world. But I do take a lot of solace in the regulations that we have in place, and working for a good operator like Occidental and Anadarko to really respect the environmental component.
Has there been anything strange, unusual, or really interesting that you found in your travels, like whether you were digging for a hole or, mapping out things and maybe tripped over a fossil or anything?
Yeah, actually, on field camp,
Oh, really?
I forget exactly where it was in field camp in Utah, but we were in a rock formation that was like 65 million years old, and we were mapping that and taking measurements. And we looked down and we found a dinosaur jawbone in the rock. And it was like, first of all, it was like, this is like amazing. Holy crap, this is like every kid's dream to find like an actual dinosaur jawbone. And then like when we were stopped to think about it, it was like, this should not be here. It's way too old to be in this formation. And we don't have really any explanation for how it got there. So maybe it was like we even our professor didn't really know. So that's an unexplained mystery. We found some really, really cool stuff traipsing through the hills in Utah. We found Native American hieroglyphics and cave art. There's a rock that's actually, even if you just rub it, it's really, really, it's called friable is the term. It'll like disintegrate in your hands. And it's a protected landmark out in Utah. But there's hand imprints and hand engravings from Native Americans like 10,000 years ago, which is just kind of like mind blowing to see. So, I mean, anytime you get out into the field, you're going to see something crazy, rattlesnakes. All that kind of cool stuff.
Great. All right, we're coming up on our time. We have time for one more question. Do you have any advice that you could give to anybody who would want to follow in your footsteps or go this route?
Yeah. I think if it's something that you're really, really interested in, you should consider, unless you're one of those people that's lucky enough that knows exactly what they want to do, that really knows that you want to be a geologist. One of the things that I regret from my experience in this is that I didn't take my early college days seriously enough, and it actually prevented me from getting a master's in it. I didn't actually have a good enough GPA. I had a great GPA in my geology courses. I had like a 3.8, but the chemistry and physics and math, I didn't really put forth enough effort there. And I wasted a lot of time taking classes that I thought I wanted to do. So my advice would be to try to take a lot of different classes and make them meaningful enough that if you end up sitting on one, or if you finding an avenue that you want to take, you're actually going to be ahead and you can apply that towards your credit. So that would be my advice. Try a lot of different things, because you're probably not going to know exactly what it is you want to do. And even if you do know what it is you want to do, you might get into it and realize it's not. So don't freak out if you don't know exactly what you want to do. I know some adults that still don't know exactly what they want to do, and they have fantastic lives. So it's a journey to figure it all out, and don't hesitate to try a bunch of different things.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Zach. This has been great. And I'm sure everybody got what they needed for their respective badges, and even the people who were just signing in to talk to a real-life geologist. So thank you very much for coming in.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Well, look at this.